Thank you. You're going to hear something of a theme happening in today's presentation if you've been here since the beginning. I was watching and listening to Mike talk about voice. And that's what I work with, not necessarily mine, but other people's voices. And I was thinking that if we walk away from today's event with one voice in our mind, it's more likely to be Saul's voice than other people's, because he stood up here and told a very personal story. And that's kind of what although it's not my story, I try to make a space for other people to tell their stories. What really matters to me is communication, the way we speak to each other, the way that we hear each other. And public radio, the program that I host, The Story, gives me a kind of a unique and privileged opportunity to try and work with that on the air. On any given day, when somebody's telling their story and I'm listening and you're listening, there are several 100,000 other people listening, and we're not really very aware of that because we're I might be by myself, I might be just with one guest in a small room with 2 glass walls and a microphone, and it feels very intimate. In fact, standing here on this stage with all of you is unlike what I normally do, because radio has that kind of intimacy, and if we use it properly, then you appreciate it for that. But what I want to talk about today is how we got to for the program that we do, and how that's kind of tied in with something of a transformation of my own in understanding journalism and the way that we tell stories. So if you'll permit me, I'll go back to start in the 70s when I began my work as a reporter. And one of my first posts was in a place called Yellowknife. It's in the Northwest Territories in Canada. It's in the Arctic. It's very cold. It's very dark this time of year. But it was a terrific job. I mean, we could rent a helicopter for a dog sled race. That was the kind of journalism we did at the time. And it was a fascinating time to be working in that part of the world, because Aboriginal land claims and native rights were just beginning. People were finding their voice. It was an area that had in many ways been settled with a very colonial attitude, and those were the stories that we worked with, and that was my daily job as a reporter. And yet, I got up every morning and I turned on the radio and I listened to stories from places that I'd never been. That was about the time of the Civil War in Lebanon, and I heard about Christian phalangists and Druze militiamen, and I listened to stories about the Syrian Palestinians and the Israelis, and I became captivated by what was going on in a part of the world that I didn't understand. Now, the one thing I knew at the time was that if I ever wanted to go there and be that kind of reporter, I had to be what's called a foreign correspondent. That's the language that we used then, and it's still used today. But take the label apart for a minute. Foreign correspondent means, yes, you go to a foreign land, but it also means that you are meeting foreign people, and you're in a place where they do foreign things. And it's your job to be something of an explainer of what is foreign. And it already sets up a kind of dynamic where it's the we and the them, it's the us and the. And in many ways, that's what the original foreign correspondents did. I mean, they were going into the heart of Africa to try and find something that was so exotic, so mysterious, so unusual, that it was going to captivate your interest. There wasn't really much effort made, and I'm talking about even in the 1970s, to take those stories and put them into a context that we understood. It was an exercise in bringing you the unusual. Anyway, I listened to stories of the Shah of Iran being overthrown and the Ayatollah Khomeini coming back. I didn't even know what an Ayatollah was, but I was, again, just captivated by what those stories were. And so I set my mind to doing that, and I did. About 15 years later, I was based in Moscow, and it was kind of a funny time because it was just after the Soviet Union fell, and I settled into my new desk. This would have been 1991 or so, and called the foreign editor and said, well, I'm here, what kind of story would you like? And he said, none. we've been listening to stories about the collapse of the Soviet Union for the past 5 or 6 years. We're kind of sick of Moscow. You can take it easy. But what we got to do was explore the places that were the former Soviet republics. And so one of the places that I went was Georgia, former Soviet Republic of Georgia, not the state of. At the time, there was a small war in northern Georgia, and so I flew into a place called Sukhumi, and it really was not a conflict that's likely to show up in your high school textbook. The Abkhazians were trying to take a little bit of land away from the Georgians, and the Georgian army was up there to make sure that that did. But in my own excitement and enthusiasm to be doing this kind of work, I got off the plane and I went to the army base where the Georgian army was, and I had my tape recorder over my shoulder and my microphone in my hand, and I was about to correspond as a foreign correspondent, and I walked up to this enormous Georgian soldier who was guarding the outside, and I said, "Dobry din, говорите по-английски, speak English," and he said, "I speak English." I said, "Good, good, good." I said, "What's going on?" And he looked down at me and he said, "It's a war. They are shooting at us, and we are shooting at them. It's a war." And I actually didn't have a second question. After some time, I figured out what it was, what kind of stories that I wanted to tell, and I had the great good fortune actually to see a lot of the world. I covered conflicts in Sri Lanka and in Africa and in Pakistan and a whole bunch of different places. Generally doing it for radio, but a little bit television as well. And I remember going to Afghanistan in the early 90s. This was before the Taliban were even known internationally. They were a sort of obscure sect in Kandahar at the time. But Afghanistan was a colossal mess in the early 90s. After the Soviet Union had been pushed out, the country was being run by this unbelievably complicated maze of mujahideen leaders. And part of the exercise in being a foreign correspondent and telling stories in Afghanistan at the time was figuring out who was in Kabul, who was in the capital, who was outside, who was trying to get in, who'd just been pushed out, and who was moving. The country was littered with landmines because every time anybody came in, they'd plant a landmine to keep the other guy from coming in. It was an absolutely crazy place to live, and the city was being rocketed from different directions on a regular basis. So I had a notebook like this, and I wrote on the cardboard at the back of the notebook, I kept a list of who was where, because I figured my job was to understand this web of mujahideen connections. I had to do that as to tell the stories. And that was an accurate decision on my part. But it was, I wish you could have seen it. I looked for it and I can't find it. I know I have it somewhere. But it had Ismail Khan was over here in the west, and Abdul Rashid Dostum was up here, and Ahmed Shah Massoud was over here, and Najibullah, no, he'd just been hanged. Hekmatyur was over here. Who was in? I wasn't really too sure, but I was one day standing outside Hekmatyur military camp, just outside Kabul, waiting to interview him. This is what we did. This is what our foreign editors told us to do. Go and interview the leaders of the factions, wherever you were. Go find the generals, the warlords, the people who are supposedly making the decisions and affecting the lives of the people. Made sense? So I went to see Mr. Hekmatyur, except he didn't want to see me. He was busy meeting with his generals at the time. And so I stood outside and I waited. And an hour passed, and 2 and 3 hours, and I waited. And I got to thinking that I didn't, again, really have a whole lot to ask this guy. In part, I knew that whatever I was going to ask him, he wasn't going to give me a truthful answer. He wasn't going to tell me why or when or how he planned to get into Kabul. That's all military strategy. He wasn't going to tell me that what he'd done was a bad thing or that he was a bad man. He was a good man. He was going to save the people. Did I believe that? No. So I'm standing outside to listen to Mr. Hekmatyur tell me his spiel, and I look across the way and there's apartment buildings, Now, the Soviets came into Afghanistan and they built apartment buildings, a sort of standard Afghan style of housing, but all these 4- and 5-story apartment buildings built in rows, and it happened to be that those apartment buildings had been on the front line, on one of the many shifting front lines, and at one point they had been severely shelled. They were all pockmarked with bullet holes, but there were big, the size of double doors, great big holes. The Afghans had pinned these heavy red Bukhara carpets over the holes, and I'm standing there and I'm looking at them, and you could see the kids pulling the carpet back and looking out. When they pulled the carpet back, you know, it was like these huge sliding patio doors on an apartment. You could see everything inside. And there were kids down in the area in front of the apartments playing soccer, and life was going on. And I was standing there and watching the life go on in these apartment buildings, and got to thinking that not only was I more interested in them than I was in whatever Mr. Hekmatyur had to say, but if I was smart as a journalist, I'd figure out a way of getting their stories on the air rather than the warlord's story. And I didn't have some sort of, you know, great transformation at that moment, but I got to thinking about that. And it came into much closer relief for me a few years later when I was in Sarajevo. Would have been 95, I think. It was a really nasty time to be in that country. The city was being hit with a lot of mortar shells, and being in the city was quite a frightening thing, because imagine yourself in downtown anywhere, and there's these great big booms going off, and you don't know if the shell landed a block away or 10 blocks away, and you turn to your colleague and say, was that outgoing or incoming? And none of it was clear. But I gotta tell you, what I saw in Sarajevo was people lining up for water. People who had taken a card table and set it up in the public market and piled on that card table everything they owned of value. Watches, jewelry, dishes, underwear, everything. They were trying to sell anything that they owned in order to get enough money to food that they needed to get by through the next day. They had to line up with buckets and jugs to get water from the few pipes that were serving the population at the time. And here's the thing. They were us. They were grad students. They were doctors. They were professors. They were journalists. They were citizens of a modern city. They were citizens who had earlier had a new car at home and a telephone and cable TV, and they just hosted the Olympics. And here they were in this kind of post-apocalyptic nightmare. And I thought to myself, God, that's us. That's not them. That's us. And it really changed my attitude about the way that we tell the stories of people from different parts of the world. I had this in mind when I when I went to Iraq in 2003. I got there, and I guess the city had fallen to the Americans about a week earlier. The looting was still underway, and we were going to do a call-in show, of all things, from Iraq. Well, it actually sort of worked, but I needed a fixer. I needed a translator. I needed somebody to help me with Arabic, because I don't speak any of it. And so I said to the owner of the small hotel that I was checking into, any ideas? He talked to one of his drivers who had a brother, thought might want some money, and the driver went off to get the brother, and I'm thinking, oh my God. And Ahmed Fadam showed up. Delightful guy, beautiful command of the English language, had been until a week earlier a professor of fine arts at the University of Baghdad. His studio had been trashed by the looters, and he was looking for work. He had nothing to do. And so we started to work together. And because he knew the city and he knew the kind of people that I wanted to talk to, he was able to take me to the National Museum days after. We walked through the National Library in Baghdad while the floor was still hot from the burning of the books that had taken place in there. We went to the School of Ballet and Music, where the looters had pushed grand pianos out third-story windows just to see them break. And Ahmed wept, and the people we talked to wept, and I found myself crying at the same time. It was very, very powerful storytelling, because he was taking me to the people who were suffering the effects, not at that time, of directly the American invasion, but of people who were looting in the city. And of course, people were drawing lines back to the invasion. But I got to know Ahmed. I got to know that he had a young son, Mohammed, his daughter, Mais, his wife, Arich. And I was only there a couple of weeks. And I had to leave. I got to go back about a few months later, saw him again, worked with him again, and then came back to the U.S. And years passed. This would have been 2003, 2004, 5, 6. We had periodic email contact. And when we set up the program, The Story, I thought, let's see if we can get Ahmed to tell stories for the program. And I contacted him and said, what do you think? And he said, I'd be delighted to talk about, the Mahdi Army and Muqtada al-Sadr and all these things, all these political forces. And I said, what I'd really like from you, Ahmed, is stories about you, stories about your kids, stories about what's going on in your daily life, because that's what we're not hearing. And he said, okay, I can do that. That was a Herculean thing for him to take on because there was no electricity and there was very sporadic internet contact with anyone in the civilian world, and yet he managed to do this. He'd write up a story and he'd send it in as text and we'd work with it together, and then he'd record it on his computer and he'd turn it into a WAV file and he'd send it to us. And some of these things came through and they were just about unlistenable. They had all kind of white noise on them like this and in the background, and we'd get a new Ahmed stories come in and we'd lean into the speakers and say, can we air this? Can we air this? And every time we decided that we could air it, and the reason is this: we will do just about anything. We will peel aside any kind of interference or distraction to hear a human voice that matters to us. Think about it. The very first reports from the earthquake in Haiti, colossally difficult to understand, and yet we wanted so desperately to know what was going on there that we told everybody to be quiet. We turned up the radio or the volume of the television, anything to try and get an understanding of what was going on there. And it was Ahmed, more than anyone else, who taught me about the power of the human voice in storytelling. Because through all that white noise and through all those distractions, you could hear his sadness, and you could hear his passion, and you could hear his frustration. He told stories about taking his son to the hospital. He told stories about the day that his dad died of cancer and they couldn't bury him because there was too much killing going on. He told a story about taking his wife and his son and his daughter and putting them on a bus for Syria because he didn't think it was safe for them to stay in Baghdad. And he talked about the tearful farewell they had at the bus station. And then he had the humility to tell a story about going back home by himself and then realizing that he had no idea how to cook. He was, and he said, I've never cooked anything. What do I do in the kitchen? I don't even know how to wash my socks. And so it brings me to what I just wanted to talk a little bit about at the end, and that is what the power of the human voice can be. I talked earlier about being moved by Saul's first-person story, and we all heard in his voice the kind of passion that you can't push aside if something really means something to you. The cry of a child, if it's yours, if it's not. It pulls at your heart like something nothing else will do. The whisper of a lover in the dark. You don't even need to know the words, right? I mean, think about those early reports coming from the streets of Port-au-Prince when people were talking about what they had been through. It didn't matter if they were speaking Creole. We watched them, listened to them, because the words weren't that important. What we say carries only half the meaning. It's how we say it that carries the other half. And I think if we lose an appreciation for that, both in the telling of a story and in the listening to somebody else's story, we lose a whole lot about communication, which is why I was saying this to somebody earlier today. Decades after radio was supposed to go under, because so many other sophisticated means of communication, it has survived, and it will continue to survive, because it embraces the one thing that we use that's more important in communicating than anything else, and that's the human voice. The reason these TED events are successful is because people have an appetite for listening to other people speak. And as long as we don't make what we say so impenetrable or difficult or in some way push people away, then we'll crave that kind of communication. I love to tell a quick story, and I'm close to the end of my time, but in 1988, Margaret Thatcher was completely beside herself because she could not control public opinion over the ongoing war in Northern Ireland. So you know what she did? She passed a law that banned the voice of Gerry Adams from British airwaves. You could put his picture up, you could put on the text of what he said, but it was illegal for a broadcaster in Great Britain to carry the voice of Gerry Adams. Is he a persuasive speaker? Hell yes. But is he a hypnotist? Was he really going to change the public attitude by being allowed to speak? No. But Thatcher, to her credit, recognized the power that his voice had. So what I figured out is that when we communicate, when we talk to each other, if we look at and look for what it is that us the same, if we look for what's human in all of us, rather than looking for those things in race or color or language that divide us, we find a great deal more in common than we ever allow ourselves to see. And if we put aside those kinds of differences, I mean, think about it for a minute. What makes something foreign is a time zone. It's a time schedule, right? That's the only thing that separates us from someone somewhere else. And I think in the willingness to listen to stories and appreciation for the fact that these stories are all human, we get a lot closer to understanding and perhaps even closer to solving some of the problems that we all face. I think that's what really matters. Thank you.